All right. What's up, everyone? I'm back at you with a brand new video. This video is going to be part 2 in the series that I'm doing, Destroying Baal from the Land. This video is going to be about altars and high places. Altars and high places. If we're going to understand the need to destroy Baal from the land, we are going to need to understand it in the context of altars and high places. What I want to share with you today is a new altar, but the same high places. A new altar, but the same high places. This is something that is found in the Old Testament book of 2 Kings, and we are going to be dealing with the life of Ahaz. Ahaz was one of the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah who sat on the throne of David, who reigned in the city of Jerusalem and did so during the time of the prophet Isaiah. And we find in his story something very significant that helps us to understand the need to destroy Baal from the land. With that being said, there is something that we notice among all of the kings of Judah. Most of the kings of their southern kingdom of Judah, particularly the righteous kings, there were those righteous kings who sat upon the throne of David in the city of Jerusalem, and they did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But despite their doing what was right in the sight of the Lord, they decided to leave something in the land. They decided to do right what was good in the sight of the Lord. They decided to obey him. They decided to turn their heart after him, so to speak, but they weren't willing to deal with something in the land. They weren't willing to confront an issue that had been in the land since the days of Solomon. And we are going to understand this because despite the fact that there were righteous kings that sat upon the throne, there were kings who refused to deal with the issues that were crippling their society, refused to deal with issues that kept the people in bondage, that kept the people in chains. So I want to talk to you about new altar, but the same high places. New altar, but the same high places. If you have your Bible or your smartphone or perhaps a tablet, I'm going to ask you to just go to the book of 2 Kings. Book of 2 Kings, the 16th chapter. 2 Kings 16, we're going to begin reading with verse 10. This is again dealing with Ahaz, king of the southern kingdom of Judah. Now Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. Very important. He saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the design of the altar and its pattern, according to all its workmanship. Then Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it before King Ahaz came back from Damascus. And when the king came back from Damascus, the king saw the altar. And the king approached the altar and made offerings on it. So he burned his burnt offerings and his grain offering, and he poured his drink offering and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. He also brought the bronze altar which was before the Lord from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the new altar. Then King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, on the great new altar burn the morning burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the king's burnt sacrifice, and his grain offering, with the burnt offering of all the people of the land, their grain offering and their drink offerings, and sprinkle on it all the blood of the burnt offering and all the blood of the sacrifice. And the bronze altar shall be for me to inquire by. Thus Urijah the priest did according to all that King Ahaz commanded. Now, very important for us to recognize the tragedy that was performed by King Ahaz. If you go to the book of Exodus, you will find God giving Moses the pattern for the bronze altar. You will find him giving a pattern for the altar that was to be in the tabernacle, which Moses was going to rear up in the wilderness. And it was that altar that was given the pattern and design not by man, but by God. If you study the book of Exodus, you study the book of Leviticus, and you even study the book of Numbers, you will find that the bronze altar was fashioned according to the pattern that God had ordained, and it was up to Moses to do what God had commanded. Throughout the book of Exodus, you will find it said that Moses did as the Lord had commanded. What we find about this altar is when you build that which God has called you to build according to the standard which God has given you to build it by, you will inevitably find the fire and the glory and the presence of God coming upon it. We see this in the book of Exodus, we see this in the book of Leviticus, we see this in the book of Numbers. We see that when the altar was set up, when the altar was set up in the tabernacle, we find that not only did the glory of God descend and fill the tabernacle, but we also find that it was God who lit the fire upon the altar. It was God who sent his fire from heaven upon the altar, thus sanctifying it with his holy fire. We know that Moses sanctified it with the blood of animals. We know that Moses sprinkled blood on it, but the altar was lit by the fire of God. The altar was lit by fire which came down from heaven and consumed the offering that was upon the altar. This altar, it was very important to recognize that the fire on the altar must be continually burning. The fire that was ignited by the living God was supposed to continually be burning upon the altar both day and night. The fire was never supposed to go out, and it was up to the priest to continually stroke the fires and continually to add wood and continue to allow the fire of God to remain upon the altar. This is something that we also see in the life of Solomon. Solomon built the great temple in the city of Jerusalem on the mountains of Moriah. We find that he erected it on the Temple Mount, and we find that he set up a new altar. It was an altar that was patterned after the one that was in the wilderness, but this was an altar that was according to what God had put in his father David's heart. And so we find Solomon in the process of building the temple. We find him also setting up the altar of sacrifice, the altar of burnt offering. And if you read in the books of 1 Kings as well as the book of 2 Chronicles, you will find that this same altar was touched by the fire of God. You will find that the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices that were on it and essentially lit the altar on fire. This is very important because when we are talking about the altar, we must recognize that it is God that sets the sacrifice on fire. It is God that puts the fire on the altar. It has never been, and it will never be, our responsibility to put the fire on the altar. What did we see in the ministry of Jesus? What did we see when John the Baptist was foretelling the coming of the Messiah? He said, I indeed baptize you with water, but there is one coming after me who's mightier than me. It was he who will come baptizing you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. The day of Pentecost was not just a day of wind, it was not just a day of tongues, but it was a day of fire. It was the fire coming down from God, being sent by Jesus, and lighting the sacrifices, lighting the offerings on fire. About 120 to be precise. When we talk about the altar, we have to understand that it must be patterned after that which is ordained by God, and the fire upon that altar must come from God itself. When we read this particular passage in the book of 2 Kings, however, we see that there was a king of Judah who presumed to erect a new altar. He found an altar that was in a pagan city, the city of Damascus, and he ordered that altar to be built in Jerusalem. But he didn't just stop there. What he did with this altar is he replaced the altar of the Lord with this new altar. He erected a new altar that would take the place of the original altar of God, which would not only require it taking the place of God's altar, but it would require a new fire to be set ablaze upon it. This was a sin that caused Nadab and Abihu to be killed by the Lord in the book of Leviticus. We find that they offered strange fire before the Lord, and fire came out from the holy place and consumed and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Now we find Ahaz, a king of Judah, not only setting up a new altar, but we also find him setting it ablaze with a fire that was not ordained and was not appointed by God. It was a strange fire. It was a new fire. It was an altar that was not ordained and appointed by God. And this is something that is very dangerous, because we are seeing this in our churches today. We are seeing it in our culture and our society today, where new altars are being built. The old altar of the living God, the altar of sacrifice, the altar of offering, the altar that is consumed and touched by the fire of God, are now being replaced by new altars men are setting up. New altars that are being set up by men who would think that they know better than God, who would seek to build new altars because they think and believe that it is a new way to worship God. And we see this through a lot of the music that's coming out in our churches today. We see it through a lot of our conferences. We see it through a lot of our teaching. And there are a lot of churches who not only set up new altars, but I would say have begun and have been guilty of worshiping God in an image they have made. They may be worshiping God, but they're worshiping God in an image that they have made. This is what was done in the wilderness when Moses was atop Horeb, the mountain of God in the Sinai Peninsula. We find that while he was atop the mountain, the people erected an altar. They erected a golden image. It was a golden calf. But what we find is they presumed to say that it was this calf that was their God who delivered them out of Egypt. They still sounded like they were worshiping God. They still acknowledged their deliverance, but they were professing this God that they had made as being the one who actually brought about their deliverance. New altar, new false God, and a false worship. And this is happening in many of our churches today, where we find that countless pastors are bringing in worship leaders and their so-called emergent and progressive worship leaders, and bringing in all sorts of music in order to appeal to a different demographic, in order to appeal to a different crowd. And as a result of it, we find in our churches, we find new altars that are being worshipped at by countless people who are being led astray. Not only that, but we are finding that there is a host of worship in our churches today that is so emotionally driven. It is designed to play to your emotions. It is designed to play to your heartstrings. It's designed to appeal to your senses. And a lot of these churches today that seek to appeal to your senses, that seek to overwhelm you with displays of light and sound and smoke, all of these different things, is nothing more than a new altar that's being built in these churches. This is something that Ahaz did while he was in Damascus. He sent the pattern back, and it was when he came back, he saw the new altar, and the first thing that he did was he replaced the altar of the Lord with this new altar that he had designed. This is something we must understand because it is present in our culture and society today. It was something that was present during the days of Ahaz, the king, one of the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, what we also have to understand, and as I mentioned before, there were kings who did what was right in the sight of God, but they failed to confront an issue that permeated their society. There was something that was in their society that these kings were not willing to deal with. They weren't willing to upset the apple cart. They weren't willing to be canceled. They weren't willing to go against the people. They didn't want to potentially incite mob rule, incite a riot. They weren't willing to upset the people. And so what they did was they left certain things in the land. What am I talking about? What were those things that the kings would leave in the land? It was the high places. The high places were what was present in the land. And the high places, we must understand, began with the very same person who built the temple of the Lord. The very same person who oversaw the building of the temple of the Lord was also the very same person who introduced the southern kingdom of Judah to high places. The individual I'm speaking of is Solomon. If you want to turn to the book of 1 Kings, we're going to go back to 1 Kings, the 11th chapter. We're going to find that directly connected to the high places was this affection for natural lust. It was this natural affection, this natural lust that would ultimately lead Solomon down a path that would not only have impact the trajectory of his life, but it would impact the generations to come. 1 Kings chapter 11. But Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, a total of 1,000 women. And his wives turned away his heart. Now, here it is. Here's where we see the high places beginning to emerge. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Notice verse 7, then Solomon built a high place. Catch that. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Please pay attention to this, because what Solomon did was not only worship foreign gods himself, but he also erected and constructed high places in the land where these false gods would be worshipped. If you go to the book of 2 Chronicles and you read of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, you will find that these high places where these altars were erected, and even the 2 golden calves that he built, the author of the book of 2 Chronicles actually speaks about these places as being such where there is a worship to demons. These are places of demonic activity. These are places of demonic manifestation. And it may seem like it's an actual place of worship, but it's a false worship. It is a form of worship that worships demons and principalities and powers rather than the living God. And it was Solomon who introduced these high places into the land. It was Solomon who opened the door to not only the false gods that they saw in the natural, but also opened the door for the demons that were behind the false gods to be manifested in the midst of the land. The same guy who invited the glory and presence of God into the city of Jerusalem and into the temple was the same guy who invited demons into the land. Catch that. The same guy that invited the Holy Spirit into the land was the same guy who invited unclean spirits into the land. And this is the danger of high places, because it was in high places where worship of demons, it's under the auspice and the guise and the ruse of false gods. But at the very core of it is a worship of demons. It is worship of these unclean spirits, these principalities that seek to infiltrate culture and society. And we notice that while it was Solomon that introduced the high places into the land, we find that it was additional kings who would sit on the throne, the same throne of Solomon, who would worship in perhaps the temple of God in Jerusalem, who would also choose to lead these high places in the midst of the land. Asa, I'm going to go through these really quickly. Asa, it says that Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. And he banished the perverted persons from the land and removed all the idols that his father made. Also, he removed Maacah, his grandmother, from being queen mother because she had made an obscene image of Asherah. And Asa cut down her obscene image and burned it by the brook Kidron. Notice what he says next. But the high places were not removed. The high places were not removed. This is significant. Jehoshaphat, another righteous king, we find this, and he walked in all the ways of his father Asa. He did not turn aside from them, doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away, for the people offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. Very important that we understand this, the offering of sacrifice and the burning of incense, because it is an appearance of worship. It is an appearance of genuine worship, but it is nothing more than what God has prescribed for himself that now is being presented to these false gods and is ultimately being presented to the demons that are behind them. Jehoash, we find Jehoash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. But the high places were not taken away. Catch this phrase. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. Amaziah, another righteous king. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like his father David. He did everything as his father Joash had done. However, the high places were not taken away, and the people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Notice we find the worshiping, the sacrifice and the burning of incense in these places. Azariah, also known as Uzziah, we find that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done, except that the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Jotham. Jotham is one of the final kings. We find Jotham, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. He did according to all that his father Uzziah had done. However, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. This is what we must understand, because there were a series of righteous kings who did what was right in the sight of the Lord, who walked in a manner of obedience before God, but they neglected to do one thing. They neglected to remove the high places. The high places were connected to the people. The high places were those locations where the people could go not to worship God, but to worship false gods. Not to go to the temple to worship the living God, but to go to these high places to offer their sacrifices and to burn incense. And this is something that is very important, because these kings, who although they did what was right, they didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to confront the high places that were in society. They didn't want to go against the will of the people, so they chose to let the high places remain. And this is something that is very dangerous in our culture and society today, because we still have high places in our culture and society. One such high place, Planned Parenthood, abortion clinics, is a high place all throughout this country. These are high places where the slaughtering of innocent infants takes place on a daily basis. And this country has blood on its hands because we have refused to remove the high place of abortion clinics. We refuse to destroy this evil from the land. And Until we are willing to remove this evil from the land, we will continue to have blood on our hands, and there will continue to be leaders that will have this on their hands because they refuse to acknowledge this and they refuse to destroy it from the land. Look at every strip club. Look at every brothel. Look at these places that promote promiscuity, that promote sex, that promote lust, that promote fornication and adultery. These are high places that are present in our culture and society. These are places that are causing the people to worship the false god of lust, to worship the false god of immorality, to worship the false god of fornication. And until we are willing to destroy these from the land, our culture will continue to be captivated and will continue to be ensnared and kept in bondage. We are now seeing that our schools are high places because we see critical race theory being taught in our schools. We see drag queens that are entering into our schools and are teaching our children. We are finding our schools are now places where gender dysphoria are present. Even in Washington, they passed a bill where if parents do not consent to their child's gender confusion and do not consent to them beginning a process of transition, they can take the children away. Even our schools are high places. Please note, I am not saying our schools need to be destroyed. I am not saying our schools need to be shut down. But what I am saying is we need to remove the high places from within our schools. We need to kick critical race theory out of our school. We need to kick grooming out of our schools. We need to kick this sexual confusion and this sexual perversion out of our schools. We are even seeing schools that are war zones where people are coming in and opening fire and killing and wounding countless people. This is something we must understand because there is even the high place in our school of violence. And this is an evil in our land that we must recognize. We must completely destroy from our land. The LGBTQ movement, the trans movement, these are high places that take place in our society. High places in our society where children are giving the ability to go through a transition with their physical bodies. These are high places, and there is a great need for the church to rise up and confront these high places. There is a great need for men and women of faith to rise up and take the spiritual battle to these high places and to do war in these high places like Elijah did when he went atop Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was a high place, and Elijah was willing to go to the high place, go to the place of idolatry, and confront the prophets of Baal. And Elijah was one who we will see in an upcoming video who actually waged war on not only Baal, but also Jezebel as well. I want to bring this all to a close by showing you two individuals, two righteous kings who sat on the throne of David in the midst of Jerusalem, and they not only did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but they removed high places. The first one is Hezekiah. Hezekiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars. He cut down the wooden image and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses has made. For until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments which the Lord commanded to Moses. We see Josiah. Josiah was the last righteous king to sit upon the throne of David before the Babylonians would eventually invade the land, would seize the city of Jerusalem, would put people to death by the edge of the sword, and would take people captive. But we find Josiah as a man who launched a campaign of holiness in the midst of the land. Then the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to follow the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes. with all his heart and with all his soul, to perform the words of his covenant that were written in the book. And the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest, the priests of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the articles that were made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. He removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places. Notice the high places have their own specific priests. Counterfeit priests, counterfeit religion, counterfeit worship, counterfeit to that which was specifically ordained by God. Lost my place. And in places all around Jerusalem, and those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the host of heaven. And he brought out the wooden image from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron outside of Jerusalem. He tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image. And he brought all the priests from the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priest had burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba. Also, he broke down the high places at the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were to the left of the city gate. He defiled Topheth, which was in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Molech. He removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord, by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the officer who was in the court. And he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. The altars that were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars which Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord, the king broke down and pulverized there, and threw their dust into the brook Kidron. Then the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, which were on the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom, the abomination of the people of Ammon. We must recognize what Josiah did, because Josiah was one who was more concerned about serving God and was more concerned about the threat of judgment that was upon the land than he was pleasing the people. He was more concerned with bringing righteousness to the land than he was with the people's opinion. He made a covenant with the people, and he called the people to righteousness. He called the people to their knees. He called the people to prayer. He called them to a place where they recognized that it was God alone who was worthy to be praised. And it was Josiah who would bring an end to the high places. It was Josiah who would come in and would launch this campaign of holiness in the midst of the land. This is what we have to recognize in our culture and society. There is a great need for us to destroy the new altars that have been erected in our churches and in our houses of worship, but there is also a need to destroy the high places. There are high places that have been in our culture and society for generations, and there is a need for righteous leaders and righteous men and women of God who will stand up and who will take the spiritual conflict to these high places and confront the false gods, confront the demons and the principalities and the powers that are behind it. This is an invitation. If we are going to destroy Baal from the land, we must recognize that we need to destroy any new altar that has been introduced, and we must at the same time take the fight to all of the high places that are in our society, whether it's to a Planned Parenthood or whether it's to a strip club. Please understand, I am not inciting violence. I am not saying go in and incite a mob and incite a riot. But what I am advising and what I am recommending is we recognize that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities. When I say we take the fight to these high places, we take the fight in the spirit. We take the fight through prayer. We take the fight through worship. We take the fight through intercession. We recognize that the kingdom of God suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. It is time for us to destroy the new altars that have been erected in our houses of worship, and it is time for us to destroy the high places that have remained in our culture and society for far too long now. I hope that this video has challenged you. I hope that it has opened your eyes to certain realities in our nation. I would encourage you to go back and watch the first video that I did in this series, Destroying Baal from the Land. It serves as an introduction. But I would encourage you to stay tuned for the new videos that I am going to post because I'm going to talk about subsequent wars against Baal in the land and how those wars must be fought in our culture and society today. Go ahead and click the like button. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with your friends, family members, co-workers, whoever you feel like sharing it with. Go ahead and click the bell so you stay up to date on all of my upcoming content. Thanks so much for tuning in. God bless, and I'll see you again next time.